Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. There are just a few very well-known names from the theatre of the 18th century: Sheridan, Goldsmith, Garrick, and some other less well-known. One playwright that you probably never heard of is John Borgoyne. Well, not as a playwright anyway. If you do recognise the name, it's probably because he was a general in the British Army during the colonial war in America, and he played a very significant role in that. A soldier who's a playwright is a very unusual, if not unique, thing. But as a new biography of General John Borgoyne shows, he was a man of many talents, a man of many lives, who deserves to be remembered for more than just events in America at Saratoga in 1777. And not least for his plays that graced the stage of the Drury Lane Theatre in the late 1700s. In his biography of Burgoyne, From the Battlefield to the Stage, Professor Norman Posser unpicks the often scarce and conflicting sources and tells the story of Burgoyne from his beginnings, through his military career and his theatrical successes. The biography also gives us a fascinating insight into the social history of London at the time, where for some life was all about the theatre, the gentleman's club and gambling. Norman Posser is Emeritus Law Professor at Brooklyn Law School and has several previous historical books to his name, including a biography of Lord Mansfield and a study of the theatre of the 18th century. I had the pleasure of speaking to Professor Posser on Zoom from his home in New York. Burgoyne isn't a character that's particularly well known from an English point of view. If my experience is anything to go by, the loss of the American colonies isn't a subject that's covered in English history classes, as well as, say, the Roman occupation or the Tudor period is, and perhaps that's understandable. I think he will be much better known to my many American listeners who presumably do cover that defeat of the English in rather more detail, particularly the battle at Saratoga, which was a really pivotal moment in the war for the American colonies. But was there one particular characteristic of General Burgoyne that sparked your interest in him to do all this research and to write about it?
No, it wasn't just one. I was impressed by his wit, his generous nature, and also his versatility. I mean, I had heard of him he was a British general, as you say, who surrendered his army at Saratoga in 1777, and that many people regard that as the turning point in the war, largely because it brought the French in, and also because it gave the Americans the assuredness, shall we say, that they could win. Up till that time, it wasn't at all clear that the colonists would be successful. But Burgoyne, what struck me was his versatility. I mean, how many generals wrote plays for the London Theatre? Very, very. I don't know if there are any others besides Burgoyne. And actually, it was that struck my interest in Burgoyne and the possibility of writing a biography of him. I was doing some research for a book I wrote on the 18th century London theatre, and particularly David Garrick, when I came across a letter that John Borgoyne had written to Garrick. And it appeared that John Borgoyne had written a play, and Garrick was interested in producing it. In fact, he wanted to have it expanded. It was a short play. He wanted to expand it into a 5-act play. And when I read that letter written in 1774, before the Battle of Saratoga, first of all, I wasn't even clear in my mind that this was the same Burgoyne who was the general in the American Revolutionary War. But when I found out it was, I was struck by how strange that was and how unusual for a general to write plays. And he wrote 4, all of which were performed at the Drury Lane Theatre, most of them in all but one in the 1780s.
You refer to him as a man of many lives, and clearly that is the case. He's quite, I think, strange for his time, as far as I know. You clearly came from a good family, but still relied on the support of his wife's family, who was from the Earl of Derby's family, to really further his career in the army. But he does, as a commissioned officer, he does seem to have been a much more humane commander than was typical for the time.
That's true. Yes, he certainly was. I found that very interesting. And I had read about his early life. He went to Westminster School and found that there was a very unusual headmaster at the time he was there. At the time Burgoyne was a student, he entered Westminster School at the age of 10, and he spent 5 years there. And this headmaster was one who didn't believe in caning boys. He believed that it was much more productive and successful if a boy did something wrong or broke a rule or did something mean to other boys, that if the miscreant admitted his wrong and showed some repentance, that was enough, and remorse, that perhaps was enough punishment. The contempt of his fellows was more punishment than getting a beating. And although I can't prove it, it seemed to me that the way this headmaster, his name was John Nicol, the way he handled discipline was very much like what many years later, when Burgoyne was the colonel of a regiment, the way he treated his men. And he didn't like flogging, which was the punishment of choice in armies throughout Europe at the time, including Britain. He was very reluctant to order a man flogged. He thought that the punishment should be adjusted to the nature of the man, the nature of the offense, and his men should be treated as human beings, which was pretty unusual in the armies of Europe at the time. And his men loved him. Even after his defeat at Saratoga, I don't know of any criticism of him being made by any officer or enlisted man in his army. And I think that was pretty unusual for a defeated general.
Yes, I'm sure. And especially given the treatment of his men after that defeat, when by agreement of the surrender, the army was effectively held in the wilderness for many years while the political situation around them was sorted out. But Burgoyne managed to come home and then still fought to get his men brought home, although that took a very long time.
Yes, well, the survivors of the captivity were not very many. There were about 3,500 men in the army that surrendered out of over 7,000 who set out from Canada on this expedition that ended at Saratoga. But when there weren't 500 men left after the brutal treatment that the captive army received, first of all, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they were marched there on the supposition, which was in the surrender treaty, that they would be shipped. A British ship would take them back to England. That wasn't honored. They were brutally treated, and while Burgoyne was there, as still the commander of that army. There was an American colonel who actually bayoneted one of the soldiers in captivity. And Burgoyne persuaded the American general in charge of the prisoners to court-martial the colonel, and Burgoyne personally prosecuted this man. Unsuccessfully, because the court-martial consisted of 3 American officers. It was very unlikely that they would have convicted him, and they didn't. But it showed Burgoyne's loyalty to his men. And his skill if you read the transcript, Burgoyne sounded like a pretty good lawyer. He did. It's unusual, and people said that at the time. Observers said that at the time.
It's certainly a shocking history of what those men put up with, and how any of them survived. I couldn't imagine after having read the descriptions of it. But just to be clear, this wasn't completely Burgoyne's fault. He certainly had his faults in terms of the planning for that campaign, but he was also quite badly served by his commanders back in London.
Yes. Well, particularly by Lord George Germain, who was the Minister for the Colonies and really was the overseer, supervisor of what was going on in America, as well as he could, because there was a distance of 3,500 miles, and it was all the communication was done in sailing ships. Germain mishandled the running of the war, but he also, General William Howe, who under the plan that had been agreed upon and actually approved by the king, General Howe, who had taken New York and was supposed to meet Burgoyne at Albany with his army, and the armies would be joined. Burgoyne was supposed to put himself under Howe's command at that point, and but Howe decided to go down and take Philadelphia instead, and ignored the presence of Burgoyne. That left Burgoyne to be alone, to be with he had about 3,500 men left to be attacked by the entire American force, with nothing in between Burgoyne and General Gates's army and the militia.
The other part of Burgoyne's life was his London life, both between military operations and after. And the descriptions of in your book about how he spent some of his time, and particularly the story of the gambling clubs and the inveterate gambling that went on in 18th century London, is another astonishing factor that I found very amusing and quite worrying as well at the same time.
Yeah, the gambling was a national passion for whether you were a member of the elite in a gambling club on St. James's Street, or you were just an ordinary citizen. Everybody gambled, everybody, including the king.
And fortunes were literally lost and won at the gambling tables.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And Burgoyne was part of this life, which was also very much wrapped up with the theatre life of the time as well in London. I think these were the same people, who were attending clubs and the such like, who were going to the theatre and enjoying the talents of the man you've already mentioned, David Garrick, who was, of course, the leading theatrical man of his time. And he spotted Burgoyne as a potential playwright for very little reason, apparently. He just saw something in him.
Well, what happened was that Burgoyne decided to write a play for a party, as a huge, terribly expensive garden party that was to be at the Oaks, which was an estate which had been owned perhaps by Burgoyne or maybe his wife. The party was to celebrate the marriage of Burgoyne's nephew by marriage, that is, the heir to the earldom of Derby to a Elizabeth Hamilton, who was the daughter of the Duke of Hamilton, I believe a Scottish nobleman. They didn't spare any money. The Stanley family, which was the Earls of Derby, threw an enormous amount of money and hired Garrick to produce a play that Burgoyne wrote. And Garrick liked the play and persuaded Burgoyne to expand the play into a 5-act play, which was eventually produced a few months later at the Drury Lane Theatre. This was before the Battle of Saratoga and before Burgoyne had gone to America. But after the Battle of Saratoga and Burgoyne's return to Britain, Burgoyne wrote 3 more plays, all of which were performed at Drury Lane.
Yes, mostly they're very light comedies, operettas as well. He wrote the libretto for an operetta, didn't he?
Yes.
But there are some interesting characters in there. I think you mentioned one particularly, Lady Bab from The Maid of Oaks, which was the play that he expanded out of this party piece.
Yes.
Because she is something of a champion for women's rights, you would say.
There's a speech she makes in it, which is very much as you say, and she's also she is apparently a gambler herself, and women did gamble in. They didn't go to the clubs; they weren't admitted to the clubs. In fact, one of the clubs on St. James's Street still doesn't allow any women on the premises. That hasn't changed. Some of the clubs, if they do allow women in, they have to go through a separate entrance. But women did gamble in their own homes. I'm talking now about elite women. One of them was the Duchess of Devonshire, and Burgoyne himself used to go to her salons where she had set up the whole thing as a gambling room. And so Lady Bab Lardoon, who is a denizen of the city, she loved London. She's a fictional character in the Maid of the Oaks. They said she was as uneasy as a mole in sunshine when she left, if she was out of London for 3 days. But she advocated, she said, this is what she said: our men and women are put more upon a footing together in London than they ever were before in any age or country. We have our Bill of Rights and our Constitution too, as well as they. We drop in at all hours, play at all parties, pay our own reckonings, and in every circumstances, petticoats excepted, are true, lively, jolly fellows. I'm not sure whether that's an accurate description of the status of women in London, but I think elite women, particularly those members of noble families, did have a great deal of freedom, including Burgoyne's wife.
Yes, indeed. So perhaps not quite the impression we normally have of the role of women in society at that time, but true to say that there were certain women that had some influence, let's say, if not power. And the story of Burgoyne and his wife is a rather romantic one, isn't it? Because they eloped very young, much against the then Earl of Derby's wishes, but remained married and very much in love until she died.
That's exactly right. There's plenty of evidence of that. I mean, some people could be cynical about it and said that, well, his connection with the family of the Earl of Derby, with his daughter, enabled him to have a successful career. I mean, to rise in the ranks to be a general, and also to be a member of Parliament, which he was for 30 years. So, yes, that is true, but I think that it's wrong to be cynical about it. It was genuinely happy marriage. after a few years after the elopement, the old Earl of Derby, accepted Burgoyne into his family. And Burgoyne, over the years, became a very close member of the family. And he had a very strong relationship with the Earl's son, the Lord Strange. Lord Strange died, and the grandson of the Earl became the heir. He became so he was Burgoyne's nephew. Burgoyne had a very close relationship with him.
Yes, he seems to have been a real mentor for the young lord, and tried to guide him in his life in a good way.
Yes, that's true.
So the playwriting comes towards the end of his life, certainly after events at Saratoga, with the exception of the Maid of Oaks that we spoke about. And there's no doubt that he suffered because of his reputation suffered because of the defeat at Saratoga in England. Obviously, the king and the government were looking for a scapegoat, and he spent a lot of time trying to defend his actions in America and explain why he behaved the way he did with the surrender. And he seems to have found a lot of solace in going to the country and writing plays. This is where he wrote the libretto for a comic opera called The Lord of the Manor. And there is a military character in that, which is quite interesting, I think, in that it sort of describes some of the things that he felt about being in the army.
This was particularly, he was a recruiting officer, and he explains his methods, which is basically to treat the men as like merchandise. He calls them skins, and there's a certain amount of money that he'll pay for certain skins. He divides them into good ones that can survive in any climate and so on, and are brave, and then there are ones that are not so good. They fetch us a lower price. And then Burgoyne, in the prologue to the play, The Lord of the Manor, reassures the reader that he doesn't mean to attack the army or to impede recruiting, but he wants to point out a very great wrong that's being done, which includes a great deal of deception. Burgoyne it's one of the instances where Burgoyne shows himself to be a reformer. He was very conservative in his views, but he was a conservative reformer. He hated maltreatment of people, but his instincts were conservative. And you see that in the best of his plays, which was The Heiress, where the noble people are all pretty good, but those social climbers, those who'd like to be members of the elite, he trashes. He doesn't like them. So he's really showing what comes out is his conservative instincts, which side we have. I think that people like Benjamin Disraeli or people like in America Theodore Roosevelt had that same kind of character. They were instinctive conservatives, and yet they had this reformist nature. His last play was called Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionhearted. It was different from the other plays. It wasn't a social comedy. It was really a historical play.
And was that successful as well?
It was. What was considered successful then was not the same thing that's considered successful today. If a play ran in the West End or the Drury Lane Theatre for 20 days, 20 evenings, that was considered a success. The Heiress, though, goes beyond that because it was translated into several European languages, I believe French and Italian, I'm not sure, maybe Spanish too, and performed in Ireland, but also in cities in other cities in continental Europe. So it was a real success.
And with the exception of that last play, they're all light comedies. So obviously they're not plays that we see performed today. But would it be fair to compare them to the writers of the time, other playwrights of the time that we might know?
Yes, I think so. I think they are the same kind of play, maybe not as good as Richard Brinsley Sheridan and Oliver Goldsmith. I think that the Rivals and She Stoops to Conquer and so are well above anything that Burgoyne wrote. I bet he fit in very well, and he because unlike perhaps some other playwrights, he personally knew the people in the social scene that he was writing about, Horace Walpole, who never had a good word to say about Burgoyne. He was a waspish tongue. He said that all of Burgoyne's speeches in Parliament and his battlefield, whatever he did on the battlefield, will be forgotten, but the heiress will not. So he was willing to say a good word about Burgoyne's, and that was unusual. Those plays have lasted into the 21st century. None of Burgoyne's plays did, but the heiress was played for 30, 40 years afterwards. I haven't had the pleasure of seeing it because it hasn't been produced, but I've read it, and the parts of it are very funny. In fact, some of it I quote in my book.
So perhaps something that is ripe for a good adaptation to modernize and bring it back to us.
Yeah. Well, I can't predict how a modern audience in London or in New York, whether they would enjoy it or not. I would think, though, I would say that the heiress has a lot in it, but of course, a lot of the references and so on were very topical then, but people wouldn't understand them today. It would have to be changed, But and I think another thing about his plays, particularly the heiress, but the others too, is that they have a moral to them. They're not just flippant plays. One of the characters in the heiress says, this is what she says, and this is said toward the end of the play, and is in a way is the moral of the play. She says, "I have ever believed self to be the predominant principle of the human mind, to reward the deserving and make those we love happy is self-interest in the extreme." I thought it's a very nice line, and so it also shows something about Burgoyne, because I think he was one of the things that attracted me to him is that he was a very decent man, a very humane individual.
My thanks to Professor Prosser for his time and that fascinating insight into the life of General Burgoyne and the theatre of the 18th century in London. From the Battlefield to the Stage, The Many Lives of General John Borgoyne is published by McGill-Queen's University Press. I've put a link to some of the online bookshops where it's available in the show notes and on the website. But of course, your local independent bookshop will be able to get your copy for you, even if they don't already have it on the shelves in store. I found it a very enjoyable and accessible read, and I'm sure you would enjoy it too. I've also put a fuller biography of Professor Prosser on the guests page on the podcast website. He too is a man of many lives. I'll be back soon when next time we continue the story of Tudor theatre with a look at some of the earliest plays from Elizabeth's reign. I'll look forward to your company then, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via Twitter at thoetp.